No, actually, we have already had the occasion, you and me, to discuss about. This is the third book we talk about in the new Mithraeum because the first one was about Mistake, which is an incredible book about the mysteries, in this case of Dionysius. So it's also an ancient call that is somehow related because it's at the same period and you have like some connections. And then we have also had the occasion to talk about the Sola-Busca, the book that you write, the Game of Saturn, on the Sola-Busca, which is also like a quite deep analysis of the situation in Renaissance, in this case, in Italy, in the north of Italy. And then even if you haven't talked specifically about Mithras, there was always some clues, some tips on Mithras. You talk all the time about in some occasions about Mithras and the Mithras cult. So even if this book is entirely devoted to the cult of Mithras, and then you have going very, very deep into this subject, you always have been interested in this rare and not that known cult of ancient times. So my first question, and I think everyone will be interested on that, is to know why, how you become interested in such a niche and then a particular subject like the cult of Mithras.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer, and I can hardly remember when I first really got interested in the larger issue of the mystery cults of antiquity. And it's so many decades ago now, I can hardly remember. Um, but I've always seen the cult of Mithras within the framework of the larger practice of mystery cults throughout the Near East, right back at least to the Bronze Age, and from my own perceptions of some of the rock art um, overlooking the Aegean. It looks like, at least from 8000 BC, um, the figures appear to be undergoing a mystery initiation, if I can put it that way. They seem to be taking the visible form of the deity that towers over them. And so this is an extraordinarily interesting topic for me, and not least from the fact that the higher yoga tantra today continues this tradition of bringing devotees face to face, so to speak, with a deity, which is the core experience of any mystery cult. So from an anthropological perspective, a archaeological perspective, history of art, and from a religious perspective, it's a fascinating area of study, and it's kind of my specialized area now.
So your book is very interesting because you are looking at different the roots of the cult of Mithras, because that's a subject that is still discussed among academicians, scholars, and people who study this kind of things.
Mhm.
And then there is no consensus actually. There is a lot of theories. We started with Franz Cumont at a certain
Yeah.
period of the time that he was like a really the cult was like a related directly to the Iranian cult of Mithras, because Mithras is a god that exists in India, actually exists in Iran, and also he has gone through different transformations until he went here. So we know that Mithra exists in other cultures, as far as Iran or as far as in India, but the phenomenon that happened here in Europe is quite unique, because you have like a certain things that aren't at all known in ancient Iran or ancient
Yeah.
India, for instance. So, and you have identified other threats that makes the possibilities still more engaging and interesting, and things that has been already talked. Also, Franz Cumont talk about Orphism, the influence of Orphism, but they don't go that deep. You really go into that. Can you explain us what do you see as the actual roots of the cult of Mithras in
Yeah,
Rome?
as you say, it's a vastly intricate, multicultural story spread over millennia. So it's impossible to summarize it. What I did in my own approach to it was to track the iconography. But because the Roman manifestation of the cult was so rich in terms of iconography, and yet so poor in terms of texts. The iconography was the main thing. And so I started like hand over hand pulling on the rope and going back. And the earliest description of an act that exactly mimics the bull killing scene or tauroctony occurs in the Epic of Gilgamesh around 2000 BCE. And it's the section devoted to the bull of heaven. And in there, it describes precisely what we see in the tauroctony, the stabbing of the bull in the neck area whilst needling on its back and trapping one of its hooves beneath a foot. And so clearly the Epic of Gilgamesh was presumably an oral tradition long before it was written down. So we're looking back, I think, to the early Bronze Age and even beyond there. So the other element I think that's been missing in this is that because the iconography tends to assume the form of what the Romans would think of as an Eastern iconographic form, there's been a tendency to go looking for it very far to the east and missing out on a whole section of archaeology, which is Anatolia itself.
Exactly.
You know, and so as we all know, the Anatolian archaeology is well established from around 10,000 BCE, with Göbekli Tepe, Çatalhöyük. You have a continuity of high culture and civilization spread over millennia. And yet, I think for many people, the deep roots of Anatolian culture are not well known. And it was within Anatolian culture that I started looking for traces of the iconography and the religious cult around the figure of Mithras. And sure enough, in the Hellenistic kingdoms, there's clear evidence in places like Nemrut. But wherever the Hellenistic kingdoms were established, you find traces of Mithraic cult. But generally, it's of a form using natural rock shelters and so on, which is distinct from its Roman manifestation. So it tends to kind of escape purview. So there's a distinctive Hellenistic layer in the development of what would become the Roman cult of Mithras. And you'll find all the elements in Anatolia from the 6th century BCE onwards. I think it's just the knowledge of that, and then the realization that some of the defining statues of the cult are explicable in terms of Orphic doctrine, really served, for me at least, to underline the fact that this was a cult transferred from Anatolia and Armenia in the 1st century CE to Rome. And it was in Rome that its iconography really experienced a very rich articulation.
Actually, our friends from Watkins books were talking about some of those images, right? Like the Tauroctonia, Mithras killing the bull, or like this figure, this very enigmatic figure that we don't know exactly who that guy is. This guy with a lion head, with wings on his shoulders, 4 wings, and with a serpent that goes around, right? And that's true that we have also other images that are very Orphic in that sense, right? And it's a mix of like a different gods and symbols. So maybe you can talk a little bit about Ion. If you call Ion, maybe it's we have other names for him. So can you
we look at the Leontocephalus, the lion-headed figure. It is clearly a depiction of the Orphic cosmogenesis. Okay, so we have this great serpent Heracles that gives birth to an egg, and the pressure within the egg is so powerful that it bursts, and the top of the egg becomes the sky and the bottom becomes the earth. And from the light emerges this figure called Phanes, pure light, pure illumination. So that is exactly what you see in the classic figure of the Leontocephalus, or for instance, in the Modena Phanes relief. It's probably one of the most famous representations of the Orphic birth of the cosmos that we have. And so every element in that relief is described in the Orphic fragments. So, for me, it was fairly simple to connect these two things together. And given the Hellenistic background, it made more sense than any other explanation I've come across.
Sorry, I
Go on.
interrupted you. What about the Tauroctony? So Mithras killing the bull. This is an image that we have other reference. We have also the victory, right? Nike, who is also killing the bull in exactly the same way as Mithras does, and it's a representation older than the ones from Mithra killing the bull. And then you mentioned that as well. So although in the Dionysius cult, also you find this image and can be related to the Orphic tradition. Can you maybe?
Yeah, again, you're looking at a thing that has been kind of part of the Anatolian dream for millennia, say, starting from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a precise description of the Tauroctony, through to the Hellenistic figure, as you mentioned, of victory, Svagion, let's say the figure of victory, sacrificing a bull. All they have to do is adjust the hand position because the Nike figure is cutting the bull's throat, whereas Mithras is stabbing it in the neck. But every element of the Tauroctony is already there, 500 BCE, and the only, given the Orphic context, the framing, so to speak, of this cult as Orphic, the only occurrence of a bull killing I can find is that of Dionysus in the form of a bull, when he is, so to speak, surrounded by the Titans and then stabbed. And so it weaves into this Orphic doctrine about the death of a god and how consuming its flesh, in a sense, makes humanity to have a divine spark in it. So I also see the Tauroctony as reflecting that in a sense. So, I think that one of the inscriptions from one of the Mithraea says, by your blood you have saved us. So there's that element in this that, the death of the god is also a salvific act for humanity.
Which recall us of other ancient
Yeah,
Iranian cults, right? That
yeah.
still exist.
Yes, indeed.
And I don't know if you wanted to add something about that.
No, I don't.
All right, so let's keep it there. Another thing that is also very, very interesting in the cult of Mithras, and that attracts a lot of attention, and everyone is very suspecting, and there is a lot of theories and a lot of, because we don't have text, and that is the problem, right? We used to have a text from Porphyry, which is a super interesting, but it's a Neoplatonic text that interprets the cave of Mithras in a certain way, in a very Neoplatonic way. But so we don't have text. We don't know exactly what happened. We have the sculptures, we have the places, we have some very well preserved Mithraeums or temples to Mithras, but we don't know exactly what was going on in there. But you elaborate a lot about that regarding the what we find, actually, the evidence that we have, and you elaborate a lot about this initiation. So we are not talking about the different grades. Just for our listeners that don't know, the cult of Mithras is think to have several levels. So starting from the Corax, the Raven, to the Pater, which is the higher level. So people probably were going one by one to reach the final level, but we don't know exactly. That is something that we find in Ostia, in a Mithraeum in particular. We find a mosaic with the representations of each grade, but we don't know exactly what was on. So there is multiple theories. Some people say that there was no 7 grades, that there was something maybe just in that Mithraeum or in Ostia or even in Rome, but in the rest of the empire, we don't find these evidences. So we don't know. And then you elaborate another. You rethink those the initiation, the initial initiation. The initiation is just a one, of course. You don't have 7 initiations anyway. You have 1 initiations and maybe some rituals afterwards. But you rethink those grades and those and the initiation and the other rituals in a certain way, more in a Orphic way, right? So can you elaborate a little more on that, because that's one of the main puzzle.
There's 2 points there. One is that you describe Porphyry's on the Cave of the Nymphs, which is our only text elaborating on the metaphysics of Mithraism. I'd just like to comment that the fact that it's Neoplatonic is in its favor. It doesn't serve to, so to speak, cancel it. Plotinus and then Porphyry after him taught in Rome amongst the elite circles, which included the emperor and his circles, for decades. So I count Porphyry's commentary on the metaphysics of Mithraism as important first-hand knowledge, not as a gloss, so to speak. It's often represented as a gloss of Neoplatonism on top of something.
Yes.
Actually, the circles in which Plotinus and Porphyry moved in Rome through all those decades would be precisely the people who would have been the initiates of Mithras, and indeed the sponsors of Mithraeum. There's like 700 Mithraeum in Rome. So I take Porphyry's testimony as first-hand valuable insight. But the larger question you raise concerning 7 grades and 7 initiations is, as you say, highly contested. Now, the way I came to this is from my background in Near Eastern mystery cults. And from that perspective, it's clear that the mystery cults only ever had 2 major initiatory rituals. The first one was a ritual of cleansing called miasis, and it was a prerequisite. You could not undergo mystery initiation without having undergone ritual cleansing or purification. So they had a powerful ritual process to enact that. But having been, so to speak, purified, the only other thing for you to do would be to go forward and get the initiation into the mystery of the deity itself. The Near East recognizes no other steps, so to speak, which are compulsory part of a mystery ritual. There were lots of other rituals done, but none of them were compulsory. They're of a devotional nature, personal preparation, and so on and so forth. So taking that framework and looking at the cult of Mithras really gives you a slightly different view of it. And what it made evident to me is that the 7 so-called grades perfectly represent the planetary progression necessary to exit the celestial realm. And the whole point of a mystery cult is that you, so to speak, directly encounter the deity who exists in hyper-celestial space. So the 7 steps towards that are not integral ritual processes. They are part of the metaphysics by which the cult articulates the notion of ingress into incarnation and egress out of it, okay, through the so-called gates of the sun. So if there are only 2 essential rituals in Mithraism, we have to account for the fact that there's nevertheless 7 grades. And I think it was Manfred Klaus who first pointed out that a lot of the higher grades would have been sacerdotal. That's to say, they were sacred offices to which people could aspire, but which were not actually the norm amongst the body of Mithraeus. So that leaves us with like an entry grade. And in my mind, the entry grade was a little like a modern military hazing ritual. And it's designed specifically to break down the social identity and to allow, so to speak, a group of equals to come together within the cult itself, devoid of their social rank, their wealth. And thereafter, I say that there's two clear purification rituals, one by water and one by fire. So that would bring you to the grade of soldier, essentially. And the remaining 4 grades, as I say, would be sacerdotal. So the lions are specifically stated to be the people who do the cleansing ritual. And thereafter, you're left with 3 grades up to Pater. So they represent the sun, the moon, and the planet Saturn. And the important point to grasp with Mithraism is that all of these cult centers were privately financed. This cult had no, so to speak, it was not part of Rome's religio, its formal religious cult, state-sanctioned, state-sponsored cult apparatus. Mithraism was entirely outside of it, so that anyone who wanted to establish a Mithraeum would have to have the wealth necessary to first get initiated themselves, learn the process, and then have sufficient wealth when they were posted to, say, Hadrian's Wall or the Danube, the Rhine, to finance the building of a Mithraea, to set up all of its furniture, its tauroctony, the banqueting scene, to provide costume, because it does appear from the Capua Vetere Mithraea that people actually wore costume for Mithraic ritual. I think we mentioned earlier the wearing of masks, for instance.
Yes, exactly.
You know, and on top of that is the provision of all the banqueting materials. So this requires a fairly stable upper echelon of people to continue to run and finance. And of course, the other interesting thing about it was, as far as we can see, individual Mithraea didn't proselytize. They didn't go out looking for people very much. They certainly seem to have replaced people who died or perhaps were killed on the frontiers, but they never seemed to expand. So they would establish for instance, 10 people or 20 people, and maintain that number of people within the Mithraeum over very long periods of time. So again, it's a very kind of stable community.
Yes.
That appears to have been built up, in which the majority of the members would have been of the rank of soldier, and with those replacement people coming in at the lower rank and then doing the purification. And then as a soldier, they would have access to the full initiation. And the whole thing was held together, therefore, by the sacerdotal levels, financially, organizationally, administratively, and of course, in terms of discipline. So this is the kind of model that emerged as I examined the evidence. And as I say, it's far more in line with Manfred Klaus's intuitions about how these units, these Mithraea actually functioned over 2 or 3 centuries. They were incredibly stable organizations once they were established, or stable communities once they were established.
So we have also, in the new Mithraeum, we have also interviewed scholars like Laurent Bricot recently, who also explains actually this phenomenon, right? It's Manfred Klaus already stated that long ago, but there is still like mostly the research go in that sense, right? It's not like these seven grades probably were another thing, were just another way to convey symbol and then to convey things that are related to the cult, but not really great. Even if it's interesting, I mean, I have always been interested in this like a great from starting like a corax, going through these different levels, through the soldier, through the Heliodromos, to the pater. But it's not really. Was not really maybe the case at the beginning of in the introduction. Our friends from Watkins Books has set like a very, very charming and interesting atmosphere of what Mithraeum could entail, could be, how you can be in there. And then I was wondering if you can also, because you have talked a lot about the initiation in itself. So we have the purification, okay, and then we have the initiations and what the initiations entails. You have studied a lot. I think that is the Mithraeum of Santa Capua Vetere that you have a study, and then there is these frescoes there with images that recalls, that let us know, that are related to the initiation. How do you see, if you can do like a explain us a little bit, how do you see this initiation to be?
Yeah, I mean, we're very fortunate in the sense that modern anthropology has given us distinct first-hand observation of intense ritual spaces. And the main characteristic of ritual spaces is that they are an atmosphere unto themselves. So that very intense energies are generated in a short period of time that radically distort our level of awareness. So rituals, for instance, the wearing of masks, ritual gestures, postures, and actions take on a supercharged significance within these ritual spaces. And part of that is the atmospherics of it. The darkness, the use of torchlight, wearing of masks. There's a distinct alien atmosphere generated. But on top of that, there is an intense ritual energy space generated that radically distorts awareness. And within that awareness, people report on seeing chthonic deities and figures within their visual space. And that part of it is I think, not discussed in the Mithraic literature. But I have taken that on board because it is a part of the anthropological record and therefore part of the scientific record. So we've no reason really to ignore it. And Hugh was quite right. The intense rituality of burning incenses, wearing masks, darkness, flickering torchlight is an intensive ritual space. And certainly when you're first entering, it's going to be frightening. It's, in fact, one of the significant characteristics of mystery initiation that is attested for millennia is that the undergoing of the mystery initiation provokes feelings of dread. I think it's described in the literature as though you're dying, is the energetic, so to speak, feeling of mystery initiation. And then it gives way to an ecstatic feeling. So, these are incredibly intense processes.
You also actually quote Cicero. I
Yeah.
found that quote like a pretty interesting, and I will just read it right away. Cicero said regarding the initiations, right? By their means, we have been brought out of barbarous and savage mode of life and educated and refined to a state of civilization. We have gained the power not only to live happily, but also to die with a better hope. So I think it's quite revealing, this sentence, right? Because we have like here two things that allows you to live happily, to have a meaningful life, right? And at the same time, you are hopeful of what's going on after death, right? So I think it's quite interesting. But also it talks about this idea of that the mysteries themselves have helped us to reach a new level, a new refined level of civilization. So it's quite interesting. I don't know if you can comment on this and how do you see that an initiation. We talk about the initiation of the cult of Mithras or other cults, Dionysius, etc. But as you said as well, there's initiations are still going on, and you have in Africa, you have different parts of in Haiti or in other civilizations that are still using and then probably living this sentence, right? It's like living a happier life, maybe, or not, or having a better hope. Can you comment a little bit on this?
Yeah.
Just from
So this is the most difficult subject matter in modern Western secular culture to even broach. I mean, it's kind of an unwelcome topic. But whether we believe this or not, the one common feature of all of these mystery cults, and whether it's voodoo or the higher yoga tantra in Tibet and India, it is the presence of higher order beings and of their providential outreach to humanity, which underpins the entire, the entire mechanism of mystery initiation. So whether we can believe in that or not, the phenomenology of undergoing mystery initiation is to have direct face-to-face contact with these beings, to be, so to speak, illumined by their energy and their light, and to realize that as an initiate, you yourself have an essential core, which is identical to that of these higher order beings, that it is your destiny, so to speak. Historically, they always put it as it's your destiny is in the stars, so to speak, as a metaphor for understanding that you have this multi-lifetime continuity, and that upon death you return, so to speak, to a pure state. And all of this apparatus is the apparatus of Orphic initiation, but it is also the apparatus of mystery initiation for thousands and thousands of years all around the globe. So we have enormous difficulty in the secular culture of dealing with this, these well-attested facts. So that's why it's best perhaps to consider it as this is the phenomenology of mystery initiation. And this is why Cicero is commenting so positively about its long-term effects.
So I see that there is a few questions already there, and if I understand it well, we'll have 15 minutes to talk about that. I will just have one more question that I think is quite interesting as well, and then we can also mention what you are doing right now, because I know that there is a few projects that are very interesting, and I'm super sure that our listeners will be interested on that. But before that, I have just one more question. You have identified Orphic, Chaldean, Neoplatonic, Anatolian, and different sources in the cult of Mithras. Have you identified anything that was properly original and unique to the cult of Mithras?
No, nothing at all. Sorry to say. Well, those sources entirely explain the cult and its operation. Well, an aeonic question. So there's no real answer to that. There is an aspect of aeonics, which, obviously the Mithraic cult can be viewed through that lens. I think in terms of the individual Mithraists, many of them were, of course, stationed on frontiers that were far from stable, and life could be nasty, short, and very unpleasant. And what I see the cult as providing is a connection to a higher sense of continuity of being, which is of a far purer nature than the debased kind of animal instincts necessary to fight. So that the cult would have been a major source of a higher comfort in the face of acute danger and imminent death. And as such, it would have better prepared people for the situation in which they found themselves. Yes, that's a very interesting knot to untie. I mean, this whole issue about the role of the bull and the bull mythos throughout the Near East, and even continuing today in the form of the bullfight, is a fascinating one. I think the image of the bull is so multifaceted. It's difficult to say there's one definite interpretation to be given. There's an aeonic perspective. There's the so-called star talk of Mithraism, in which the bull is possibly visible in the night skies and related to the Hyades and the Pleiades, and therefore to the emission every summer of a stream of meteors, which are often seen as a healing emission from that portion of the skies. So there's an astro-religious aspect to the bull. And then there's just the commonality of the bull from how far back? Çatalhöyük, we see clear evidence of bull cult. Therefore, the expansion of farming from Anatolia into from east to west and throughout the Mediterranean and the Aegean accounts for the transfer of these fundamental mythos, I would have to say, of the bull. And of course, at the lower level, we can look at the bull as a symbol of base instinct, the drive, the life force, that for a spiritual person needs to be brought under control. So there's also that aspect of it. So really a very, very wide-ranging set of symbols and significances attached to the figure of the bull. So I couldn't answer on the connection to Ammon, but of course, at its core, the cult of Mithras, the initiation brought the initiate into the presence of the ancient god Kronos, who is the archaic Saturn, not the planetary Saturn, the archaic Saturn, who is also Amun. So you can see that, in fact, all of these cults in Egypt, in North Africa, Anatolia, are essentially facets of a deeper and larger cult of Saturn. Yeah, I don't really have any thoughts about it. What it does is give a convenient, so to speak, hanger upon which people can generate a set of rituals. Now, whether they have the potency of a mystery cult or whether they simply serve as a progressive refinement of the person, as Masonry claims to be, I find them equally valid, to be honest.
So regarding that, I will just mention that on the New Mithraeum, we have an article about Freemasonry and then the parallels between Freemasonry and the cult of Mithras, and it's striking because there is a lot of like parallels. You can see the temples are similar, the tradition, the different grades. There are a lot of things that are very similar. So I invite you to go and read it if you like. It's Gabriel Simeoni who has written that.
Right. I'm not aware of a female cult of Mithras. It is possible. There was talk of a grade of hyena, I think.
Mm.
Okay. Now, what I suspect is that in the very sophisticated elite circles around the emperor in Rome, where the cult probably was first established, it's really quite possible that women may have had a significant role. What I doubt is that on the front lines of the empire, whether there was a significant role for women. And I think just because of the nature of the environment, it became a fully militarized cult in that context. But I think Rome could well have been a very different, had a very different relationship to female initiates. Gosh, well, the book really covers very much the material we've discussed tonight. The Anatolian roots are fully explored. This nexus of Orphism, Neoplatonism, and its metaphysics as a key to unlocking the iconography is well covered. But the other side of the book is really looking at the distinct ritual operations performed in Capua Vetere Mithraea and dissecting them so that we can get an insight into what it actually meant to be inducted, what it meant to be purified by water or by fire from a ritual perspective. And I've significantly enlarged upon that based on anthropology and on ritual practices. So that's a significant addition to the literature on Mithraism, because it's not something that's really dwelt on. That's to say, the phenomenology of initiation. And I think that's perhaps the unique point about the work I've just written. Well, I think that the legacy is manifested in masonry. I agree with that. What I think is missing is the high intensity that the mystery cults used to be able to generate. And that's a kind of expertise and a level of devotion which is very much missing in the West today. There's very few people, able to devote themselves, I think, so intensely to a deity, to manifest it in a ritual space. And that certainly exists in the Higher Yoga Tantra, the Indo-Tibetan tradition. You find it as well in the voodoo cults, but most of the well-known cult apparatus within Western esoteric tradition is run on a far tamer energy source, so to speak. It's not as wild and unpredictable as the mysteries were. It's not such a formidable ordeal to undergo initiation. No, I don't think so. It's impossible. I mean, it never had mass attraction. Like any mystery cult, it was too intense, even for the people who underwent the preliminary purification rites in the mysteries. The full initiation step afterwards, 90% of them did not go forward to become full initiates. It was too intense, and nobody wanted to, so to speak, come face to face with a deity or confront the chthonic entities that emerged during the ritual process. And the other aspect of it is it's clear from the records that we have that these cults were never proselytizing cults like Christianity. Okay, they had a small establishment and they maintained that establishment. They were secret, and they had almost no presence in the public sphere. Even though the Mithraeum may be near a temple, it was a closed space. So it never had the ambition, so to speak, to become a religion. It retained the essence of mystery cult initiation throughout its life. This is like mainstream Orphism or Neoplatonism. Essentially, your ethical behavior from life to life determines your subsequent incarnations, and you're always bound by haimami, the necessity, fate, and anke. So that it is only through self-purification and unification with the providential outreach of a deity that you can escape this cycle and become, so to speak, a person who chooses their incarnations between lives rather than submits to incarnation. I think that's it in a nutshell. We know that they were the financiers of the Mithraeum. We know that they were the administrative and disciplinary levels, but also the crux of the mystery initiation would have been in their hands. And specifically, the Pater appears to have, at least in one form, used the metaphor of the bow and the arrow to convey the deity's energy to the initiate. And in that context, the other two grades representing sun and moon effectively hold the ritual space. In the ritual space itself is a turbulent one because it's bringing such intense energy through. So it needs to be, so to speak, cordoned. And I perceive that the higher grades, the three highest grades, are responsible for the generation of that space and for maintaining it long enough for the initiate to receive the full influx of the deity. So what the modern age has, which the previous ages lacked, is access to information. And right now we have some of the most powerful tools imaginable for self-purification under the heading of energy psychology, for instance, or family constellation therapy, which allows you to surface and dissolve ancestral karma. So, you know, almost every town and city in Europe, you'll find access to these modalities. And it's just up to each individual to go and grasp them, learn them, and apply them to themselves. And they can make far more progress in the space of just a few sessions than could ever be conceived in history beforehand. Unfortunately, I haven't. I think it was closed when I tried to go. But I went to San Clemente, for instance, when I was in Rome. So I tried to visit all the Mithraic sites and see the mosaic marbles that I could when I was in Rome. Yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which what we would call an egregore in esoteric discourse carries a current from civilization to civilization and remains there as a potent source that you can tap into. And you may want to call it the subject, the unconscious, if you like, but it is that sense of a group soul or group mind, which never perishes. And it's just up to each person to activate their connection with it. So let's be clear, when we talk about the cult of Saturn-Kronos or Amun, we can look at it from the point of the phenomenology of the encounter with that deity is a state of non-dual awareness. Okay? It's a timeless non-dual awareness, and you can recognize that realization in almost every mystical and spiritual tradition that this planet has ever known. So that in the Near East, it's known as the cult of Saturn or the cult of Kronos, the golden age, when all time stops and perfection reigns. But it is phenomenologically a state of non-dual awareness, which continues if you can stabilize it through the process of dying and rebirth. That's the cult. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, their egregore is the planetary Saturn. And if people know better than that, I'm ready to learn. But my understanding is that they practiced magic rather than theurgy, and that they were more interested in practical magical effects. So that I would characterize them as a Saturnian cult, definitely. But I think it's the planetary intelligence that they're attuned to. I mean, I found clear evidence of that in the cult of Dionysus. Clear evidence in the frescoes of the Villa of the Mysteries. If there was in Mithraism, I really don't know. I couldn't find any evidence. I don't know if you did, Andrew. If you came across any evidence for entheogenic use?
Well, there is actually one scholar from the US. I don't remember exactly his name. I was looking for that. That has written a book on that, on this, on the possibility of the use of entheogenics in the cult of Mithras. It is something that has been said, I think, for any imaginable cult or religion or everything. So probably it's in the root of religion, right? The entheogenics.
Well, I think there's two things. One, during the 60s, when they first uncovered the peyote cults in Mexico, Aldous
Mm,
Huxley and all of those people, there was a
yes.
rationalizing argument that all the spirituality and all the mystery cults were explicable in terms of entheogens. Therefore, it was a way of bypassing the step that they didn't want to take, which is to say there's a deity that is communicated with in these cults. So it became a kind of part of the psychologizing discourse around religion and mystery cults generally. My own experience is that the entheogens act as gateways. They are not in themselves the experience of a deity. They are a gateway to it. They allow you to sidestep a certain part of your persona's controlling grasp on reality. But that's it. They do not explain what happens afterwards.
So usually I found that regarding the cult of Mithras, the scholars who wrote this book, it's called Mushroom Myths and Mithras.
Yeah, I have that.
And it's quite revealable. It's Carl P. Ruck, Jose Alfredo González Cedrán,
Yeah,
and Mark Alwyn Hoffman. So
yeah.
for those people who are interested, it's a read.
That said, the evidence is very slim. You
Yes,
know,
because
it's
actually, and we.
really slim, and that includes for the mysteries of Eleusis. So although they had this drink,
Mhm.
there's no way of demonstrating that it was entheogenic. Not when you consider they were doing the initiation, the major initiation, not the purification for 3, 4, and 5,000 people simultaneously. Okay, it just doesn't make sense that they were all, cued into it. And just as on a personal note, I once had a blessing at a teaching given by the Dalai Lama in Copenhagen to around 10,000 people. And when he gave the blessing, there was like a blast of energy. I felt it like fire around the head. And it was instantaneously transmitted to all 10,000 of us. And it just, it doesn't make sense to say you could induce this kind of effect through the use of entheogens when you're dealing with thousands of people. I think the telesterion in Eleusis could hold 5,000 or 6,000 people in its final form. So it doesn't make sense really, to think of them all as doped up. Yeah, I have no evidence for that whatsoever. They were so discreet. They were so tightly knit communities. They appear to have no public face whatsoever. And all the evidence that we're discussing in terms of the was unknown until the 15th century, 1,000 years after the cult had ceased to operate. And most of the evidence is probably in the last 150 years, actually. It's completely been buried as a major mystery cult, but it was Western Europe's premier mystery cult, and that's what makes it so important to attempt to recover its ritual process.
One last question regarding we talk about that a little bit at the beginning, that Peter, you are preparing different things. You are I know one in particular because I'm attending, so I'm very willing to go to Turin and meet you to talk about the Sola-Busca. But you mentioned other things to me, and I think it's a good opportunity to talk about it a little bit.
I think there'll be a supplement to Ritual and Epiphany, possibly coming out from Theon this autumn. It's called A Visible God. And it's looking at evidence that was given to me just as I finished the book and therefore couldn't incorporate it. And it's by Henry Lampikowski. And what he suggested is that the dark nebulae and valleys in the night sky itself, in the region related to the cult, actually depict the Tauroctony and the other figures. So what we've done with Henry's help is to assemble astrophotography of those regions of the sky. And I've written an essay to lead into this, in which I discuss this issue of astro-religion and how microcosm and macrocosm are fused in the ritual process to make sense of this spiritual vision. So I'll be working with Theon this summer and autumn to bring that out. It'll be like a supplement, a thin supplement to Ritual and Epiphany. Apart from that, I'll be at Top Culture in Berlin in October. I'll be presenting Ritual and Epiphany there with the aid of AI-generated ritual processes. And as Andrew just said, we have a workshop on the libertine imagery of the Sola-Busca in Turin with the House of Sophia, the end of August, first couple of days of September. And apart from that, I think that's it. Thank you so much, Andrew. I appreciate your interrogation.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks to all the watchers for their questions. The rotating panel showed either Tauroctony or the banqueting scene. And what I would think is that during the initiations, the Tauroctony would have been relevant. But outside of the ritual process, the ritualized feasting that was a characteristic of Anatolian cults seems to have been imported into the Roman cult. And therefore, it would be appropriate, therefore, to show the banqueting scene, because it is a sacrament. Although it's not an initiation, it's still sacramental. What I've done is take the very, very badly eroded frescoes of the Capua Vetere Mithraea, which were documented by Vermaseren back in the mid-60s, and used those to develop script along with the visual imagery, which have reconstructed the ritual activities in full 3D and color. And they'll be on display in Occulture Festival in Berlin this autumn. So it's a use of a union of AI and esotericism for the purpose of reconvening the ritual processes, let's say. Next time.